We now sort of turn from regional inequality to a very, very key political economy issue. And then we go back to trade and labor market in the presentation after this. Because a key representation of both the crisis and the period that led up to the crisis is both sort of arbitrariness in economic decision making and also the motivation offered by crony capitalism. However, here's a scholar who's dived a little deeper. She explores the changing nature of decision making of key decisions taken, and I think that she has a very, very exciting set of the conclusions that she's going to present. Yolani Fernando, she's an MA in Governance Development and Public Policy from IDS Sussex, where she was a Evening Scholar. She's presently the Executive Director at Arutha and leads their tax research team. The discussants include Dr. Igor Gryshk. Thank you very much for joining us despite late notice. He uniquely combines a career committed to human rights with an abiding interest in economics. He holds a PhD in economics and is presently Human Rights Officer, Economist with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Dr. Gopa Thampi is the second discussant. He served recently as Senior Advisor for Governance with the OHCHR Foundation. His expertise covers governance reform, public finance and accountability, and institutional capacity building. Over to you, Yolani. Hello. Can we invite Yolani, please, to make a presentation?
Hi, Srini.
Morning, welcome.
Good morning. I hope you can see me and you can see my presentation.
We can do both.
So, yes, good morning to everybody, and thank you to the Nirantar Trust for the opportunity both to write this paper and now to present it. I am straddling two worlds here with this paper, so you will forgive me that I will give background for both worlds. Because I don't want to assume that anyone is familiar with both sides of this story. So just to kind of get into how I ended up in this paper and this kind of problem of trying to figure out Sri Lanka's accountability deficit, it starts with, sorry, the presentation is in... So the story for me starts actually with, thank you. The story starts with a hashtag that was demanding accountability not too long ago. And the hashtag was, of course, Go Home Gota. And for me, it was a great example of the fact that the people of this country knew what it meant to demand accountability when the leaders of this country clearly failed them, and failed them in the most sort of fundamental ways, in the whether it was the fuel queues, the power cuts, all of this. It was a very fundamental erosion of people's living standards. And that's sort of where my kind of story starts. But I do think that for me, one of the issues was that there was this sort of narrative about corruption being one of the key causes of the crisis. And it generally tends to overtake a more boring explanation of what happened, which is one that it was one of public financial mismanagement, both over decades that caused several structural issues in our economy. And then the more immediate public financial mismanagement, which I will be focusing on in terms of the policy decisions that led to the sovereign default from 2019 to 2022. And for me, the key question that often gets missed is, how did so many devastating policy decisions go completely unchecked? And I will sort of go through some of the policy decisions, and I kind of want to illustrate that there were so many ways and so many times at which these things could have been reversed, but there was no real avenue for the other institutions within the state to actually check the overmighty executive presidency. So the answer for me, really lies in what I have termed as Sri Lanka's accountability deficit. Now, why accountability deficit? This kind of goes back to the fact that there's a standard diagnosis with about Sri Lanka's economic issues, and that is that we have a twin deficit problem: budget and trade deficits, persistent over decades. And subsequent governments have sort of really not done much to address this, except in a few odd cases here and there. And now, of course, post-crisis, there is significant attention on this. But so while that is sort of clearly diagnosed problem, what is left undiagnosed is the root cause of why so many unsound macroeconomic policy decisions are made over and over again. And for me, at least part of the answer to this question is that there is a third deficit, an accountability deficit, that is caused very specifically by the concentration of power in the executive presidency. And what that has meant is that parallel state institutions have almost completely lost the ability to hold the executive presidency accountable. So, and that is the framing that I'm using, the framing of horizontal accountability that, I believe is essential and was definitely absent during the lead up to the sovereign default and, of course, the subsequent economic crisis. So very broadly, my question ended up becoming, to what extent did centralization of power within the executive presidency contribute to the policy decisions that led to the economic crisis? So let me first give a few caveats in terms of both the methodology and in terms of the limitations of this paper. The paper is only going to be focusing on fiscal and monetary policy, a part of macroeconomic policy, only focusing on fiscal and monetary. One of the reasons why industrial policy is left out is because of the inevitable role of the private sector in such a industrial policy. Due to the undocumented nature of policymaking, and this is not just Sri Lanka, but in general, I have relied heavily on key informant interviews and sort of use process tracing and supplemented with extensive desk review. And while this particular paper uses the economic crisis as a central case study, I have delved into certain historical policy decisions, and there is a small tangent on the parallel decline of the public service, which I will also touch on. So the two sort of worlds that I am straddling which is sort of one on the economic side and one on sort of the constitutional side. So just to give a quick background on the economic side, this is a very basic timeline of the sovereign default. And we kind of start with the 2019 tax cuts, which, was the first domino in this series of policy decisions. They were, sort of a key economic policy of the government that came in 2019. it led to a revenue loss of 560 billion LKR, obviously kind of with COVID pandemic and all of that, everything sort of got worse, obviously. But while they were announced in 2019, the fact that not many people know is that the operationalizing of it happened in 2020 and 2021. So there you start to see that there were occasions in which these things could have definitely been reversed or changed, especially in light of external factors like the COVID pandemic, but they were not changed. So as a result of the tax cuts, we were already in a pretty fragile state with the tax cuts. Plus the pandemic, we lost access to international capital markets. And what that, sort of means in, sort of layman's terms is that we lost the ability to roll over debt, which is an essential part of the kind of debt that we had, especially international sovereign bonds, which at the time of our default were about 36% of our foreign debt. Then we sort of have the government's sort of homegrown solution. This is, restricting of imports to save dollars. There were sort of many sort of decisions in that. One of those decisions was the chemical fertilizer ban, which was displayed, which was kind of repackaged as an organic farming policy, but was really just about, stemming forex outflows. Fixing the exchange rate. And then, of course, in 2021, this affected our remittances with people using, alternative methods of remitting money back to Sri Lanka. And then we come to what I would consider the final nail in the coffin, which was repaying the January international sovereign bond in 2022, where we paid $500 million. And that, obviously really hit our forex reserves. And in April of 2022, we announced our first ever sovereign default. So now on the other side, just a few key constitutional amendments to keep in mind that have the more recent ones. In 2010, we had the 18th Amendment that, really expanded the executive presidency, taking away term limits and kind of just increasing the executive's power over parliament. Now we have a sort of a quick rollback of that with the 19th Amendment. And, term limit restored, you have independent commissions, we have the new sectoral oversight committees in Parliament, which I will get into later, and also the Constitutional Council, which puts a very specific check on the executive presidency in terms of the appointment of key figures in, in Public Service Commission and so forth. But then we come to 2020, where the 20th Amendment kind of comes in, rollbacks most of this. But even with the 19th Amendment kind of, actually reforming things broadly, for the better, you have to know that, these were it was very short time period. And the argument can be made that it wasn't really enough time for most of these institutions to really take root. And that's kind of going to be one of my points as well, in terms of really identifying the de jure versus de facto changes, checks and balances that are in place in the Sri Lankan state. So focusing on the executive presidency itself, the almighty executive, I think this is a term that was made popular by Yolani Fernando, and it really captures the nature of the executive presidency, this rather large, unwieldy animal that we have, created and sustained. And one of the points, of course, I want to make is that centralization of power within this office is not new, and it is by design. So one of the chief architects, and definitely one of its biggest proponents, was, of course, the first executive president of this country, J.R. Jayawardena. And when you sort of look at the theory that kind of backed up this reform, his sort of reading of the Sri Lankan economy and the policies that were being made at the time was that we have a parliament that is getting swayed by public opinion and not able to make the tough decisions required of a developing country. And in his mind, this can be, sort of the tough economic decisions can only be made by a leader that is shielded by this public opinion, shielded, in many ways from electoral pressure. And this, I think, is an argument that, sort of has not held. In fact, since we kind of taken a bit of a historical view on the executive presidency, you see that it kind of really ended up being the opposite of that. And one of the reasons why the theory of the executive presidency didn't quite match the practice of it is that the checks and balances via parliament, and since I'm focusing on fiscal and monetary policy, the Treasury and the Central Bank actually led to unsound policy and persistent twin deficits. So the dream of kind of making this, unaccountable figure or office, which, is able to look beyond the short-termism of electoral politics and short-termism of electoral politics, and really look at the country and the people and development of a country. It really didn't pan out. And one of the problems that I definitely kind of saw was that Parliament has become, subservient to the executive. Now, Parliament and the executive, should be, on a level playing field, but our Parliament has definitely become, sort of, kind of been pushed into a rubber stamping role. And it is not, by any means a watchdog or a check and balance, on the executive presidency. And, you can sort of see this because, according to the Constitution, of course, Article 148, Parliament has full control over public finance. But, sort of what generally happens is that when the executive, that is, both the presidency and cabinet of ministers kind of pass a policy and, present legislation, there is little or no scrutiny from, Parliament and the parliamentary committee system. And just to sort of give a little bit of historical background, two of my sort of favorite points that came out of, the study was that of the ministerial consultative committees, which were established with the Second Republican Constitution, kind of transformed members of Parliament from being legislators or scrutinizers of the executive into partners of the executive, partners in the development of the country. Now, this doesn't sound too bad, on the surface, but what it does mean is that, the legislature, which is supposed to give that check and balance to the executive, the incentives are, wrong, because the ministerial consultative committees kind of became this place where MPs will come to kind of, make sure that they would be sort of told about the policies of the executive, but they were, mostly encouraged to be sort of constructively critical rather than, sort of be hard-nosed on, sort of being holding the executive accountable. And I think there's quite a bit of mix-ups in terms of incentives because one of the sort of features that were introduced, also during this time was the decentralized budget. For those who don't know what that is that members of Parliament, sort of get, what is known as a decentralized budget that can be used for development activities in their constituency, regardless of whether they are in government or opposition. Now, this has become pretty discretionary. So you do have instances where, sometimes government may not, be either not giving the decentralized budget to opposition members or sort of trying, kind of being an obstacle in that course. But this does kind of change the very nature of what a member of parliament is supposed to do. So, and it also has changed in many ways what people expect of an MP. You ask the average person, they don't really see their members of parliament as legislators, but rather as primarily or only as sort of the source of, sort of job placements, school placements, and, sort of the person who's supposed to see to their sort of general infrastructure around their constituency. And this is normal across countries. Like, this is not, sort of something unique, but what I do argue is that ours is, sort of pretty far gone in those terms. And also I do want to note that this is not necessarily a phenomenon that started with the executive presidency, because there are very specific references to the fact that from 1947 to 1972, you do see this kind of decline with, members of parliament not really taking on the role of a legislator, but rather a partner in development, as I said. But I would say that, one of the things that I found quite stark was the parliamentary committee system. And I've had some, sort of very direct dealings with the parliamentary committee system. And what I would often find is that sort of this idea of oversight is, sort of it has made a comeback, but, the parliamentary committee system isn't really designed for oversight anymore. Now, part of it is sort of this emphasis on things like the ministerial consultative committees. But, the other is that, okay, so you have these sort of, I would say, three main oversight committees: Committee on Public Finance, Public Accounts, and Public Enterprises. And, the way that they, sort of, the way that they provide oversight is generally when, the opposition holds the chair of these key committees. And this is now true of the Public Finance Committee. But in 2020, the government used its parliamentary majority to take over the chair of that as well. COPA has long now been, the domain of government. The chair of COPA is generally from government, but this was not always the case. COPE, it has sort of a kind of gone between government and opposition, but ultimately this really just shows that, no one quite understands, and no one seems to even think that this is quite a problem, that opposition is not in charge of these key financial oversight committees. And definitely the 2019 tax cuts and even the chemical, fertilizer ban, like there was no real scrutiny. And even when there is opposition, if there are no formal avenues by which you can hold the executive accountable, there is no point in these committees if they don't have the teeth to go with their, oversight. One thing I would like to note also that is that, committees like COPA and COPA are post-mortem post-mortem committees rather than like the sectoral oversight committees, which were introduced in the 19th Amendment, which are actually supposed to scrutinize legislation beforehand. But these are not being utilized as such because they're new. They have not, really been integrated, and they don't get the kind of research support that they need. The same can be said of the Public Finance Committee, which also lacks institutional research support, because whereas COPA and COPE have, the power of the Auditor General behind them. The Public Finance Committee does not have researchers, and sort of forces the members to actually rely on the Treasury, but which of course doesn't make any sense because the Treasury is the one that comes up with the policies in the first place. So, and, this kind of does illustrate how, you have these devastating policy decisions that are happening without any, real recourse from, Parliament and the parliamentary committee system. Moving on to what I see as sort of compromise fiscal and monetary policy. There are few points here, but the main point here is that the Executive Presidency's reach just dominated the Treasury and the Central Bank for decades. And this is one of the key reasons why fiscal and monetary policies were, so short-termist. And definitely during the crisis, this became even more apparent. So two problems. One on the side of the Treasury is the CEO-CFO problem. This was, I think, first identified by Mick Moore, who called it the absentee financial minister arrangement. And what this means is that, for decades, we have had, definitely since after JR's presidency, we have either had presidents who took on the finance minister's portfolio or had a kind of a nominal finance minister who was either controlled by the Treasury Secretary or the president themselves. And this has, really blurred the lines between the CEO and the CFO. And I mean, in the sort of the private sector kind of model, like you would never, sort of think of this as an acceptable thing that the CEO will also be the CFO. But somehow we have made it acceptable in this country that the president, who is supposed to take on more, sort of wide look at development, should also be in charge of the fiscal health of this country. So what happens when, sort of wider development is in opposition to the fiscal health and sort of long-term fiscal health of the country? What wins out? Generally, not fiscal health. And, this is sort of, we've seen it time and time again, and definitely during the economic crisis, it became even more apparent, because during the crisis, you had, sort of this, sort of, there was no separation really of, president and finance minister. And going on to the sort of the side of the Treasury, the central bank, before the Central Bank Act that was passed, there was a revolving door between government and central bank. And then there was some sort of very, there was the Treasury Secretary's seat in the Monetary Board, which meant that monetary policy constantly had to accommodate fiscal positions. Now, this becomes, and this sort of kind of proves the point that, as to why the central bank was making these policies that were clearly, detrimental and, sort of short-termist. And one of the things that came out during my study was that, in fact, in the pre-2019 period, the Monetary Board had actually, adopted some reform measures voluntarily, like abstaining from, primary market purchases of treasury bills and things like that. But this was fragile, and it's especially kind of revealing that during the 2019 to 2022 period, there was a direct instruction from the Presidential Secretariat to ignore the Monetary Board's decisions, which meant that the Presidential Secretariat was effectively dictating monetary policy. So for me, these two are, fundamentally, sort of flawed aspects of our state institutions, where the Treasury and the central bank were not able to keep a check, or even voice opposition in many cases to fiscal and monetary policy decisions that were being made. And when you have that happening constantly, you end up, I suppose, where we ended up.
Yolani, you'll need to wind up in about 5 minutes. Sorry.
Yeah, sure, no worries. Quick tangent that, kind of happened during my paper was sort of seeing the parallel decline of the public service. And I won't get into it a lot, but suffice to say that, with the sort of centralization of power within the executive presidency, you also had the parallel decline of the public service. And this has a lot to do with, sort of significant things like the power of politicians to transfer officers without due process, kind of permanent secretaries no longer being directly held accountable to the Public Accounts Committee, but rather, only sort of, only held accountable by politicians. And this rather, sort of unfortunate relationship between politicians and public service just kind of ended up in a what has been identified many times as a deep-seated political patronage system. So where does this leave us? It kind of leaves us with the fact that during the economic crisis, we definitely didn't, there was no canary in the coal mine. There's a silent canary that, could not at any given point in time hold the executive accountable for the actions that were being taken. Now, this is despite, national, international experts, telling us that, we were heading in the wrong direction. This is despite a credit downgrading that clearly stated that our fiscal policies were not sustainable. And all of this sort of happened, for me, it seemed pretty obvious that there was this erosion of horizontal accountability over decades, and that kind of stems from this idea that, so going back to JR's own thinking about this, like that there was some trade-off between governance and economic development, and that we must choose economic development. But for me, this is a false choice. And I think, sort of one of the things that I really wanted to do with this paper was to marry the kind of siloed debates between sort of constitutional reform and economic policy making. In terms of sort of the future or sort of recommendations, I do think that the economic reform agenda would be incomplete without this emphasis on increasing institutional accountability and the governance reforms that have come out with the IMF governance diagnostic, the civil society governance diagnostic have, sort of put an emphasis on governance reforms. But I would say sort of, it is not just the anti-corruption reforms. There are, sort of more deep-seated issues that also need to be addressed. And while the 21st Amendment has rolled back some of the things from the 20th Amendment, which were definitely kind of impeding accountability, it does not expand on the functions of the parliamentary committee system. And for me, a key thing is that it doesn't prevent the executive from holding the finance portfolio, which I think is essential. And I think, sort of finally that, we have in place new economic legislation that is, sort of creating this, new landscape, which is positive, but there has to be sort of commitment to these laws. We have seen laws previously, we have had laws as well that was simply never implemented well. So a commitment towards kind of bridging that gap between, laws and practice. And yeah, I will leave you with this picture, and which I think is a great example about what happens when different kind of accountability works. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolani, for closing with that most sort of cheerful slide. Let's hope, I mean, and thank you in particular, drawing attention to the need for certain, structural changes in decision making. You, for several reasons, have not really spoken about your work on the bureaucracy, on the nature of bureaucracy, which at one level may be related to a certain objective, but then certainly resulted in a decline in the quality of the ability of bureaucratic, so whatever the causes might be is of less consequence. Is Yeah, there may be a debate, but it's certainly so. So maybe if you have time at the end, but I'm not sure what the order is for the discussants. But since Igor is sort of visible and he's been kind enough sort of keep thing open, thank you very much for joining. We turn to you first for your comments, Dr. Igor Gryshk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I was just following the conversation, and I hope like we go with the order as better for the discussion. Thanks again. It's my pleasure to attend this event and to present few ideas on behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Office, and in particular the section working on economic, social, and cultural rights. And following great Yolani's presentation, I would like to offer some more reflections on, from the human rights perspective, on economic reforms, taxation, budget, and the role of the parliament and other governmental bodies. And with a particular focus on accountability, one of the most cross-cutting and core human rights principles. And I would like to just briefly speak about how this principle must guide the design and implementation and oversight of economic and policy decisions and reforms. It's well established already that economic reforms policies that could negatively affect human rights are more commonly found in the context of economic and financial crises and its responses. But both in the times of crisis and without any crisis, only those economic reforms that are carefully formulated based on human rights norms and standards can contribute to the better enjoyment of human rights. However, examples from the countries going through the financial crisis have shown that economic reform policies have negatively affect the availability of fiscal resources and hence negatively affect the enjoyment of all human rights, including economic, social, and cultural. For example, as highlighted in Yolani's paper, the Sri Lanka experience demonstrates that potential risks when accountability mechanisms in fiscal decisions making are weak. One of those examples Yolani made was that 2019 tax cuts drastically reduced revenues and undermined fiscal stability, while those cuts were adopted with a little meaningful parliament debate or scrutiny. This is why we believe that international human rights norms and standards place a strong emphasis and provide safeguards on how economic reforms should be designed, assessed, and implemented. According to international legally binding human rights treaties, states are responsible for carefully examining different policy options in all times and for determining the most appropriate measures in light of human rights obligations. These obligations apply to all branches of the state, including executive, but also judicial and legislative. This means the government must carry out a human rights impact assessment before recommending or implementing economic reform policies that could foreseeably undermine the enjoyment of human rights. Such assessment should take account of the evidence of the experience of right holders, but also civil society, human rights defenders, and experts. When it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights, these obligations are concrete, and those obligations are stemmed from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. States are obliged to progressively realize economic, social, and cultural rights by all appropriate means, which requires states to design and implement fiscal, tax, debt, trade, and other policies, including even environmental policies, so that they are deliberately directed towards the realization of human rights. And states also must demonstrate that every effort has been made to mobilize all available resources, even in time of economic crisis. This is an obligation of a state, which means that state must generate, adequately allocate, and make use of the maximum of their available resources to move as effectively as possible towards the achievement of full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. These principles, they apply and must apply to taxation, which is the core determinant of this fiscal space needed to advance realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights highlights that effective taxation system must be transparent, participatory, and evidence-based, with meaningful involvement of stakeholders. What does it mean in practice? Is that tax policies design should foster public debate and allow scrutiny of distributional outcomes and support informed decision-making. Economically, this means that there should be the oversight body to examine the role of the taxation, and in particular, the tax to GDP ratio and overall resource mobilization capacity, the balance between direct, individual, and corporate both, and indirect consumption taxes such as VAT. Also, the scrutiny should be put on the distributional impact across income groups, gender and disadvantaged populations, and to ensure the equitable taxation. And again, the scrutiny from the oversight bodies is needed to ensure that fiscal and social returns of tax exemptions and incentives, including those linked to the natural resources, is also designed in a human rights compliant way, which means that they benefit the population in need. To summarize on tax, the tax policy should be understood not just a fiscal instrument, but the resource for advancing rights, in reducing inequality, eliminating poverty, and ensuring that economic reforms are both sustainable but also have fair and socially justified meaning. But tax justice and fiscal responsibility are not only things important to analyze. Accountability in how budgets are made and spent is equally critical, and the role of the parliament there is also huge. Governments must be accountable for their fiscal decisions and ensure that public funds are used and distributed in the best interest of the society. This accountability over the budget process can be facilitated through mechanisms such as budget transparency, audits, and citizens' participation in decision-making process. The budget of the government is one of the most important economic policy tools to facilitate the fulfillment of human rights. One of the key principles of the right to development is active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of development benefits. Public participation in the budget process facilitates accountability and builds trust and social cohesion. In this respect, the role of the parliament in the budget process is central to ensuring that public resources advance the realization of human rights. At all stages of the budget process, parliament has to play a role. And if we talk about the approval stage of the budget, parliament is responsible for reviewing and, when necessary, amending the proposal to ensure that allocations reflect human rights priorities and address key gaps. And also, they need to ensure that the budget is compliant with the obligations of the state under economic, social, and cultural rights. This includes the engagement with civil society and national human rights institutions and other stakeholders to ensure the transparent review and participation in budget process on the formulation and approval stage. During the budget execution, Parliament exercise oversight and must exercise oversight to verify that funds are spent and as approved and in accordance with human rights standards. And at evaluation stage, Parliament should review audit reports and findings to determine whether spending has effectively contributed to the realization of human rights and hold accountable if not. Importantly, these evaluations provide an evidence base for future budget cycles. A recent Sri Lanka budget process provides a concrete illustration of both opportunities and challenges. 2022, this year budget reflects certain positive shifts, such as increased allocations to education, health, and social security. However, at the same time, showing reductions in some other key areas compared to even last year. But
Igor, you might need to wind up in a minute or two, please.
Sure. So what we managed to notice that during the third reading of the current budget in the Sri Lanka Parliament, the Parliament considered amending 28 budget heads, including increase of 250 million for health, 10 billion for pensions, and 1 billion for education. While it didn't change the total level of expenditures, these adjustments illustrate the potential of parliamentary debate and oversight to recalibrate fiscal policies, balance competing demands, and create opening for better alignment with human rights obligations. I hope these reflections complement the discussion in the paper by underscoring that accountability for fiscal and economic policy choices, whether in reforms, taxation changes, or budget allocations, is not just optional, it's coming from the legal obligations under international human rights law. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Igor. That's quite interesting. But just in the interest of time, let me just turn to Dr. Gopa Thampi. Can you please come in?
Yeah, thank you. Srinivas, can you hear me?
Yeah. Will 10 minutes be enough for you?
Yeah, I'll try to even make it lesser than that. Let me try to get the camera on. My system camera has been having a accountability deficit of late, so I have to rely on an external camera. I hope it holds good.
Set up a standing committee for it. Yes.
Yeah, let me begin by very quickly, thanking the Neelam Tiruchelvam Trust for providing this opportunity to serve as a discussant for Yolani's very important and timely paper. I had the privilege of seeing the first version of it in the draft form. So it was a double delight to read the final refined and more robust version. So let me start by thanking Yolani for a very kind of thoughtful, empirically rich, and conceptually ambitious study. And I believe that this makes a significant contribution to our understanding of the political economy of economic crisis, both in Sri Lanka and potentially elsewhere. If I have one minor complaint with the final version is that I thought the title is too tame for the potent contents it holds. I would have much loved to see a title, something like "Can the Canary Sing?" which would have been a bit more provocative. Now, leaving that aside, I think the paper arrives at a very critical moment, and not just in Sri Lanka's post-crisis trajectory, but in the larger and broader context of the conversations around the erosion of democratic institutions under formally elected regimes. So it has a wider implication than what it might look like. What I liked about this paper in particular is that it is compelling in its refusal to treat the 2022 economic collapse as a technical or purely fiscal matter. Instead, it offers a governance-centric or governance-centered diagnostics, very emphatically arguing that the root of the crisis lies in long-term dismantling and erosion of horizontal accountability institution across multiple institutions. The central argument that this particular crisis cannot be comprehensively understood or unpacked without foregrounding the erosions of horizontal accountability across critical state institutions resonated very strongly. This is not a narrative we often hear in economic commentaries, and it is to the authors, Yolani's credit, that she weaves it skillfully through historical, institutional, and policy-based analysis. In particular, I thought I should kind of highlight a couple of contributions which I thought stood out in terms of its originality and its implications. First, the introduction of the third deficit a sibling to the usual twin deficits of budget and trade deficits, is both elegant and very, very analytically powerful. It offers a very interesting conceptual pivot to reframe the crisis from one of economic mismanagement to one of systemic governance failure. And I thought it's a very clever metaphor that works on multiple levels and has a real potential for broader comparative use. The second point is that the institutional scope is impressively wide, but never diffuse. By drawing analysis of the Executive Presidency, Parliament, the Treasury, the Central Bank, and the public service, we get to see multiple vantage points from where the political concentration of power created an environment for unchecked and often damaging economic decisions. From a methodology point of view, the integration of qualitative data is a real strength, especially in a policy environment which is very opaque. The decision to blend document analysis with insider accounts is both methodologically appropriate and very, very substantive. Again, we get a rare view into the internal dynamics of institutions, like the Committee on Public Finance, the COPA, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, which is very critical to understand how formal accountability mechanisms are subverted in practice. And I think Yolani's own personal vantage point in the spaces as an insider has given this very, very unique insight into this. And finally, from points that stood out, by connecting Sri Lanka's particular case to broader patterns of autocratic deepening, I think the paper positions itself within the literature of hybrid regimes. The parallels drawn to El Salvador, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe reinforces the broader relevance of the study. Ultimately, it is not just about Sri Lanka, it is the institutional fragility of competitive authoritarian states that it speaks to more broadly. I have a couple of reflections, certainly not critiques, but to deepen the conversation and in no way trying to detract the paper's many strengths. One is, I thought, even though the third deficit is a highly effective framing device, there is still room to strengthen the theoretical underpinnings. For example, the literature on delegative democracy, Guillermo Ordonel's state capture, and very interestingly, Frankel's dual state model. These are alluded to and touched upon, but perhaps in some other version, one would like a little bit more deep dive into some of these theoretical underpinnings to amplify the contribution of political theorists and scholars of hybrid regimes. The methodology, like I mentioned, the qualitative use of data is very well appreciated. But personally, I would have wanted a little bit more detail on how this interview data was analyzed and validated. How claims were triangulated with archival or media sources. Now, in context where policymaking process is informal and elite-driven, these questions become central to establish the credibility of the qualitative work that is done. So a brief discussion on positionality, response biases, or strategies of how do we ensure interview anonymity would strengthen future researchers who are interested to follow your path. So, and the final one is to look at accountability beyond the state. And this is the last picture you had, Yolani. Now, given the prominent role the 2022 Araglia protest had, and using that as a conceptual point of departure, I was wondering whether a brief discussion on diagonal accountability, that is how accountability exerted by citizens and civil society, would that warrant a little bit more discussion? For instance, a question I have is, bodies like the COPF, the COPA, or COPE gained any traction in the aftermath of these civic mobilizations? Did their protests create more institutional ripple effects, or was it absorbed without any structural consequence? I think engaging with this question would perhaps widen the the discussion around accountability is not just vertical and horizontal, but also the diagonal accountability, which has a very, very powerful way of exerting pressure from outside. Just to conclude, I thought I'll just put two kind of forward-looking questions, just as a contribution. The first is to ask whether institutional reform can succeed in contexts where executive dominance is so deeply embedded in political culture. As you rightly presented, Yolani, in your presentation, Sri Lanka has had multiple constitutional amendments. But as you yourself showed, the promise of these formal reforms have been reversed or rendered toothless. Now, what does this say about the relationship between legal architecture and political norms? And this becomes very critical in the current environment when we have a slew of new acts and reform measures going in. Can they stand the political pressures in the way people are nominated to key positions? Can it be insulated from political pressures, which has historically subverted, however good some of these reform and measures have been? And the second is, how do we guard against technocratic temptation? Now, in the wake of economic collapse, there is often a push to fix things. Can the accountability pipe be fixed without touching the broader governance aberrations and challenges? Shouldn't we look at institutional reforms much broadly and not just economic reforms? And how do we ensure that such reforms stay beyond being cosmetic? So, Srinivasan, I'll end here and give space for, I'm sure, more pertinent comments to come by. Thank you once again for this opportunity. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Gopa. We will quickly do a small round, Yolani, before giving you time to respond, in case there are some questions from the audience. Please, I mean, if there are any interventions from the audience, we'd love you to speak up, but also keep your interventions brief so that we have time to listen to you. Any questions, please?
Can I make a few comments, please? My name is Rajesh Durai.
Yes. Sorry. Basi Rajendra, you will have to restrict yourself to 2 minutes because we're running beyond our session time. We have to close at 11:35. Go ahead, please.
That's fine. Look, being in Australia, what the country should do is to compare maybe different provinces measurements, in terms of different how they are performing, right? And also the country also should have a tendency to compare with other countries as to in terms of GDP and so many other factors. For example, one of the things I find fault is that the terms of government, the national government is 5 years, whereas when you look at Australia, it's only 3 years. And when you look at the different state level and the local level, it's 4 years. So in Sri Lanka, if the term is brought down from 5 to 3 years, if the government doesn't perform, they can get kicked out. So I will stop with that. There's more to talk, but I will not take more time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me turn to Yolani for brief responses before we can wind this up. Yolani?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Igor and Dr. Gopa, for your comments, and Dr. Gopa for always asking questions that I don't have answers to, that I don't have easy answers to. I would say that, so if I kind of go backwards on that, is the executive presidency, so entrenched that, institutional reform will be either, near impossible or impossible. The more I look into this subject matter, the more, I'm convinced that, it doesn't stop with a constitutional amendment, as you sort of clearly saw in the presentation also, that there is this, it's not just one person, it's not just the executive presidency, it is this ecosystem that has been created because of the executive presidency, because of its overreach, because of the severely unaccountable nature of this office, that, it is, far more pervasive than, people realize. on sort of this, the vertical and diagonal accountability, yes, I am interested in it, and I do hope to kind of explore this in the future. And I take your points on sort of the theoretical framework, some of which are there in the paper, and I didn't touch on during the presentation. But maybe sort of kind of going back to sort of kind of connecting sort of vertical, diagonal accountability, and sort of what Dr. Igor was talking about in terms of taxes and bringing people into the conversation. And this is something that I do now on a regular basis through the work of my organization, Arutha. And one of the things that we constantly find is that sort of the social contract around taxes in Sri Lanka it's very specifically skewed because you've had a middle class that has grown, sort of the debt-driven, consumption-driven growth that that we were talking about in the previous presentation. The middle class has sort of benefited from low taxes and energy subsidies, fuel and electricity especially, but you also have sort of health and education and sort of social transfers that have happened. So you have a kind of a small and ever dwindling welfare state, and all these sort of subsidies and low taxes. Now this is pre-2017 and all. And when you talk to people even now about taxes, they will immediately kind of come at you and be like, but what do I get from my taxes? And then you're just like, well, we are sort of, we do have this welfare state, and sort of it's never kind of there's this sort of disconnect, I would say, that we have gotten used to certain kinds of sort of public healthcare, public education, without having to pay our fair share of taxes at sort of the middle income level. And this has created a very strange social contract, which I don't see having changed at all because of the crisis. And I would say that that's one of the things that kind of impede public dialogue also, when you have this incredibly unfair tax system that has been putting the burden sort of on indirect taxes, and we all know who ends up sort of paying a larger portion of their income when you rely on indirect taxes, and it is of course the poor. So, and we've come to accept this tax system as normal because, it was politically expedient to give, the middle class income tax breaks and ignore, a majority of the population that were burdened by para tariffs and, sales taxes. So, yeah, just to kind of comment, that definitely when it comes to sort of talking about vertical and diagonal accountability, I also think that the conversation needs to be injected with a few of these hard truths about, how unfair our tax system was, and the fact that, now we've kind of adjusted it because we fell into such a bad state, but that the future of this tax system has to be sort of reducing this terrible, tax ratio that we had of kind of an 80-20 of, sort of indirect to direct taxation. And it's something that, can't be fixed overnight. But, definitely sort of income taxes are part of it, and, exploring other more unpopular taxes like property taxes, I think definitely is also a small part of that. Yeah, but I will stop there in case, Srini, you have any comments.
No, we're running out of time, but I still want to draw your own attention back to what you began with, in a sense that you've not explored the nature of reverse influence, in fact, the private sector on the state. And that's important. Peter Evans and others have written about that. And this is particularly important in the experiences of South Africa, Malaysia, of other countries in Southeast Asia, and of Singapore particularly, And in terms of could that be countervailing over time in those contexts, and would that work or not work here? If so, what has been Sri Lanka's experience with that is something that holds for the future. I think you already covered vast ground in your current paper, so this is by no means saying that you could have done that within the confines of this paper. Yeah, just a brief response.
Yeah. No, but I will say, Srini, it's a very, important point. And I think sort of, what I said in terms of the social contract, on taxes, the private sector definitely, the middle class and the private sector definitely played a huge part in this incredibly unfair tax system that we have now. And I have noted just once in the paper that, when the tax cuts happened in 2019, the private sector actually were big proponents of it, which kind of just shows, sort of, and it only subsequently, long after the economic crisis had come and devastated us, was when, people in the private sector actually kind of came and be like, okay, maybe the tax cuts were bad. And it just sort of shows that short-termism that is, also, disastrously part of, sort of private sector thinking as well. And I'm talking about, sort of, some of the main chambers of commerce that, did not think to, oppose this, which I think, is, definitely a topic for maybe a whole other paper.
No, it's very important, Yolani. It's very important because you see, you should, at the same time, not to put that, okay, so you open it out to the private sector, but also to point out how they too have been driven by a certain set of interests. So that would be a good thing. But let's stop here. All fascinating questions for you to take into the future and your group at Arutha. So, so all the best to you.